Right, thanks for inviting us to this. It's not my first communist university one either. Last time I was at Sheffield University, I tried to get in to see a band, and the porter stopped us like, and I said, are you a member? And I said, well, I'm a reciprocal member from Strathclyde. He said, well, where's your card? I said, I haven't got my card. His mate says, let him in. Any Geordie who can say reciprocal must have been to university. Last time I was here. I'll draw your attention to my little book called Power to Imagination. Had I known I was following on the last debate, I would have structured what I was going to say in a bit of a different way, because I was going to talk in general, really, about the working unions and the way communists should have a perspective towards that. But there's some more fundamental questions in there. I think you mentioned before, Mark, the question about the need for sub-editing. Well, the subtitle of this book is Revolutionary Class Struggle in Trade Unions and the Petty Bourgeois Fetish of Organisational Purity. And if anybody wants to know what that means, you obviously missed the last lecture. I actually had got down 99 angels stand on the head of an angel before I gave up. When I've been talking normally, particularly to students, but also people on the so-called movement, which isn't the movement that it used to be, because it's changed its complexion. I have to start talking normally about the centrality of the working class, why the working class is important, because people don't get that anymore. You know, what's this about the working class? You know, the working class is some sort of tired, cloth-capped image, you know, and why do we need to bother with them very much? Many people in the so-called movement, the anti-capitalist movement, are not from the working class themselves and feel uncomfortable with the working class and breathe the huge sigh of relief when they believe that they're gone. We don't need them anymore. And if we just put together enough sort of progressive people, enough minorities, if we can find enough minorities together and organise around the minorities, or gays and lesbian issues, or other issues, the environment, or animal rights, or whatever, we can put a whole conglomerate of issues together, and everybody can feel comfortable about talking about these things, and this will be the progressive movement that challenges capitalism. Missing entirely this centrality of the working class and why we talk about the working class in the first place. Now, I'm sure in such a distinguished revolutionary gathering as this, you don't need to be reminded of what this is all about, or do you? Because the reason why workers engage in struggle isn't because they've read some books or something. It isn't because they've been philosophically struck by this lightning bolt that tells them, you know, Marx and Engels and some other clever people said really you shouldn't live under this system. It's because workers have to go to work to live. It's not a hobby, it's not a philosophy, it's not an ideological principle, it's a fact that the capitalist class captured the means of existence from humanity. They stole our means of life from us. And we have to go cap in hand and ask them, can we be alive for another week, please? Can we go to work, please, for another week? Can we have the money? And according to the level that we get of this money, selling us back the products that belong to us and the stuff that we've created, that's the level at which you can live. So at that level, I find it profoundly arrogant that somebody says we need to belong to a particular special kind of organisation that actually tells us these things. You have to belong to a communist organisation, a Marxist-Leninist organisation, which will instruct us all as to why this system is wrong. Well, I can save you all the bother and all the argument. We already know it's wrong. And we've known it was wrong for some considerable time. So the idea that workers challenging the rate at which they're exploited is somehow false consciousness, trade union consciousness, economism, or whatever you want to call it, is just pure shite. There's never been any struggles that the workers have engaged in around the question of wage struggles, hour struggles, safety struggles, or the others, where it didn't dawn on them that we shouldn't have to be fighting for this. We should get rid of the whole goddamn system. That was a conclusion people came to a long time ago. Now, I don't know if people were brought up on the Webb's history of the British trade union movement have been brainwashed by the notion of this top-hatted trade unionism and the labour aristocracy and all that. But that is certainly a very false image of the working class movement in Britain and around Europe and around the world, particularly in the capitalist world anyway. While ever it's certainly true that we did have top-hatted unionism, I'm jumping ahead of myself really with that. Marx talked about the free market, which is much in vogue at the moment. I had a visit to China a few years back, and everybody believed in the market. And when I told them I didn't really believe in the market, they looked at me like I was stupid, because the market means having a motorbike or having a television or, you know, having a fridge, and that's the market. The market is the same as these things. It wasn't a system of exploitation. But Marx talked about the market where everybody brings their stuff in, and the rate of demand will determine the price of the commodity that you get, what you get back, the profits that they get back, etc. And if you brought a wheelbarrow full of apples, and there weren't many apples around that particular day, then obviously the price of the apples would be dearer. If there was a glut of apples, it'd be cheaper. Labour enters this market to sell its product, its labour power, and it wants the highest rate of return. But the laws and the codes that apply the sale of our product isn't the same as theirs. We can't act like the wheelbarrow full of apples and wheel it away when we don't get the price, because then we're confronted by the armed bodies of the law. Then we're confronted by police with riot shields or whatever, because they insist that we can't take our product off the market. Labour is treated in a different way. But we learned a long, long time ago in the working class that since they employ so many of us to produce the wealth, if every one of us went in individually and flung our cap on the table and say, what are you going to pay me, gaffer? And you say, well, look, I'll do the job for 10 bob. And the bloke who comes in after you says, you know, I'll do it for 2 bob. And the bloke after him says, well, I'll do it for 10 bob. If you get a declining rate of wages, a declining rate of subsistence for yourself, and you get poorer, basically, and the boss gets stronger, and the boss gets richer. So it didn't really take a long time before working people decided that none of us would go in, unless all of us went in. And we would set a rate that we wouldn't work for, even if it meant we suffered for a time. We either wouldn't sign on, or else we came out and wouldn't go back again, unless the wages were increased. In order to do that, workers had to see themselves as a collective, as a class. So, if you were a docker, say, nobody would work on the docks unless you got a particular rate for unloading a particular cargo or whatever. You might get the odd person who come along who wasn't a docker, who said he'd do it for less, but usually these people were inefficient. And workers formed organisations in order to restrict the supply of labour onto the market in order to maximise their earnings. Now, that would seem like common sense, and I'm sure everybody here is aware of that, but what is not perhaps apparent is that it's a short step to realising that if we have the power to stop the supply, to stop the produce, to stop the profits, we could take the whole thing back. And I know of no period of history, of trade union history, when workers in one form or another and in various sizes of numerical degrees of strength didn't see through that whole thing and seen the struggle for the next day's wages to be linked to the struggle against the whole system. And I mean, the Chartists were mentioned earlier on. Chartism was a political conclusion, but it was drawn up by, it had its sharpest edge in the organised working class. The sharpest violent wings of the Chartist movement in the potteries and in the mines were people who could see every day what the system was about. They didn't just go, they weren't just taking political protest and arming themselves and equipping themselves with field guns and all the rest of them like they did in Newcastle. Big monster rally in the 1800s where they turned up with field guns and fowling pieces, 100,000 of them, such that Peterloo could never happen in Newcastle without the other side getting a real damn bloody nose. People could see that the conditions at work were related to the political system, and the people that were the advocates of Chartism were also the leaders of militant working class struggle. The executive of the Miners' Union occupied half of the executive of the Chartists. at one point. The same organisation frequently changed hats and were the same people. So I reject entirely the idea that somehow trade union consciousness prevents you from seeing that you don't just want another a fair day's wage for fair day's work, which is a slogan we would also reject, but that we want to smash the wages system. We want an end of the wages system. We don't want to be exploited. We want to control our own labour and our own labour power, particularly. Now, of course, when you got people throw up this stereotypical image of like the trade union, which is your particular trade. Well, yes, I mean, we could argue about whether or not they were called trades unions or not, which many of them were. But it was true that you got people in specific trades who, in order to maximise their earnings, kept other people out of that trade and only allowed people in to stop dilution of the trade and keep their wages high. But I know again of no instance where any one of those top-hatted unions, the Coopers, for example, the people who made the barrels and stuff like that, didn't also take solidarity action alongside every other section of the class every time it was engaged in struggle. In other words, this sectionalism, as it's been called, was never exclusionism to the extent that, or sectarianism to other members of the class. It was a recognition of the class as a class. Now, there are people who are class traders, of course there are. There are people who, in the leadership of the union, start to see, you know, they want anything for an easy life, start to approximate in terms of their manners and behaviours, and particularly in the days of, in the 19th century, when if you got in with the mill owner or the mine owner or whatever, you could have a canny time of it and be pretty well paid. Of course, these people start to see their interests in a different way than the working class, but that doesn't mean that the organisation itself is somehow reactionary, bourgeois, or whatever. All it means is that the class struggle takes place within different levels of the class. There's a class struggle that takes place in unions. The unions themselves are not class consciousness, but the struggle within unions breeds class consciousness. And class conscious workers will fight within the union for revolutionary socialist ideas. There's nothing whatever in any organisation that I've ever belonged to that stops us raising revolutionary slogans, revolutionary demands within unions, or seeing across the board of unions the need for cooperation, etc. Now, the industrial workers of the world, which I'm pleased to be a member, started off as a vision in 1909 that we would set up, that the workers would means of securing better terms and conditions in the here and now, as well as fighting for a different world, would be through the industrial unions. Now, the industrial unions were starkly in contrast to the major unions at the time, the CF, the Confederation of Labour and the affiliated labour, the people that were craft unions that only allowed craft workers in, or the general unions that would have anybody in based across industry. The industrial unions came up with the idea of one industry, one union. And a classic example of that would be, for example, the National Union of Mine Workers, where if you worked in the canteen, you were in the National Union of Mine Workers. If you were a fitter, if you were an electrician, if you were a surveyor, if you were a clerical worker, if you were a coal-face worker, whatever, you belonged to the National Union of Mine Workers because you were in the mine industry. Previously, we had like the National Union of Railwaymen, now the RMT, which also followed that industrial unionist idea of therefore uniting people in those industries. But the IWW tended to wanted to unite all workers in all industries through industrial unions into one big industrial union. This immediately gave rise to the workers' committees and councils in each particular factory, in each regional body, and each local assembly. I think Lenin, in one little footnote, acknowledges that Daniel Deline and the IWW predated his concept or recognition of the Soviets as being organs of power. I don't believe Lenin ever believed in the Soviets for workers, believed the Soviets would be organs of class power. I think it was a cynical ploy. I don't believe Trotsky ever believed in them either, to be frank. Although they continued to talk about them, they continued to repress them. And they were always getting in the way. However, that's an academic debate, really, at some point. And you know, it's sufficient to say the idea of the industrial union as an organ of class power, of fighting for a better day's wage now, linked to the struggle for the abolition of the wages system. The preamble of the IWW, it's only a paragraph long, talks about there being irreconcilable differences between the working class and capitalism, and that we aren't going to resolve that situation until we smash the capitalist system. The beauty of the IWW was it was already in place, ready for the takeover of power by the working class, so that the instrument which would, instead of being a separation of like the union fighting to a point where it, in a period of capitalist crisis where it pushes against the contradiction of capitalism so hard through a general strike, for example, and then you go looking around for some kind of political leadership on the outside. I'm not sure that we ever did go around looking for that political leadership on the outside, but there was always people there who attempted to provide it. The Communist Party in particular, I'm thinking of 1926, for example. You made a right bollocks of it then as well. Workers could already have, through their own instrument, through their own organisation, the means of fighting against the system now, but also replacing the system through workers' control and workers' councils that would be run and administered. So the self-same organisation was this side of the revolution and that side of the revolution. Now the IWW was, of course, ruthlessly repressed in America. There wasn't any big debate about it. It wasn't that the ideas died out or anything. They just shot them, jailed them, smashed the union, particularly in their opposition to the First World War and also the partial opposition to the Second World War. Undoubtedly, too, what broke the IWW to some extent was the expectations of the Russian Revolution. Many of the IWW leadership went to Russia. Big Bill Haywood, for example, and others went because they thought the scene in this so-called Soviet revolution, the ideas that we were fighting for, and for a time, anarcho-syndicalism and the Leninists appeared to be on the same side for a time. It wasn't long before that shite was knocked out of us when we found out that there was actually a difference between those who believed in the Soviets as organs of power and those who believed in the political party as a replacement of those. I'm quite well aware of the argument of people who think they can use the Vanguard Party as a way of influence the Soviet, etc. I'm aware of that argument. In reality, on the ground, that has never happened as far as I know. And always one became counterposed to the other. So I think that the question really isn't just a matter for me as to whether communists need to work in unions because workers are in there and you can influence them to come and join your party, but that the means of fighting against the capitalist system is in through the union, at the rank and file level anyway, at the level of building workers' committees and councils, through revitalising the shop stewards movement. There are current moves at the moment. There's a Northern Alliance of shop stewards which is holding regular meetings. We're trying to rebuild that level of the movement. Despite all attempts to abolish the trades councils, alliances of all unions in particular regions and cities, that movement is also revitalised itself. And also we've had the rebirth to some extent of the IWW, for example. Now we're not measured in thousands in Britain, but we are measured in hundreds, which is a change. And I would have thought that if you belong to any union, that the union you should belong to is also the IWW, because the IWW acts already as an instrument of connecting all rank and file struggles and with political struggles around the idea that we need to smash the capitalist system and get rid of the wages system. So from that point of view, it's an organisation which communists can intervene in. The position of the IWW, for example, is we don't believe we're not a political organisation in the sense of a party political organisation, but we're not a non-political organisation insofar as being anti-political parties. You can belong to a political party if that's your particular thing. If you're an anarchist or an anarcho-syndicalist, of course you wouldn't think there would be necessity for that. But both wings of that movement can be reflected in the IWW. I think that what was one or two of the other things I wanted to take on? Yeah, I think really I've dealt with the question about this thing about trade union consciousness. I think that's a red herring. I don't think you need to be in any particular organisation to raise consciousness. It's struggle that breeds consciousness. You know, it's Marx didn't invent the class struggle, he observed the class struggle. Class struggle occurred and occurs whether or not people are not recognise it. Like we don't need Marx to tell us that there's a class struggle. We don't need a political party to tell us that we need to overthrow the current system. The workers can come to those conclusions. We need organisation, certainly. I'm not against political parties myself. Political parties can be quite handy, but I don't believe that political parties are fundamental to anything. As I say in this book, just to conclude on the last thing here, a lot of what is basically caca, for want of a better word, has been spoken and is being spoken about the special nature of revolutionary organisation. Let us be quite clear, the only thing an organisation requires in order that it be revolutionary is a working class composition, conscious of its own oppression, conscious of itself as a social class, and the determination to overthrow the existing order, to initiate a new form of society based upon social, political and economic justice. To do this, there is nothing to stop a trade union, a tenants association, or the regulars down the local boozer from constituting themselves as a revolutionary organisation if that is what they were committed, if they were all committed to that end. True, the original design of the organisation may be ill-fitted for its new role, but this is a minor detail which can be elaborated in the struggle. The revolution does not require some fundamental premise, the existence of a monolithically or democratically centralised Leninist or otherwise party. Neither does it require some pristine and political virginally unsullied by trade union, social democracy, reformist, anarchist society or federation. It requires only the revolutionary working class.
Okay, we've got Alan Stevens from the CPGB now.
Okay, well, just quickly to respond to that last point, and I think I can understand that as an argument about a lot of the errors and mistakes of the past, and about some of the formulations as to the types of parties and so on. But certainly the CPGB's position is the classic Marxist position as well, is that the party is not separate from the class. The party is a part, an integral part of the class, and is made up of its best elements. And so what is expressed through the party is the best of the class. Okay, and that's a completely different idea to the idea you criticise. I know there's been a long history of those sorts of problems in the past. That's not what we are aiming for. To some extent, at a certain level, I think this is fairly simple, and that is, okay, to a certain extent, and I come from a similar industrial, militant background to the miners. Miners, dockers, both long histories of industrial, militant action, unofficial actions, very, very strong rank and file movements, much greater democratic control of the union machinery than in most other unions, although also very limited. One of the things that was very clear to me coming from that tradition is that yes, you can, through struggle, achieve a certain level of consciousness. Workers can themselves come to recognise what a crap situation I'm in, let's have a different world. But having that realisation is not enough. You have to have a programme. You have to have a political programme that encompasses not just where you work, that encompasses not just the working class. There are other people as well. There are a whole range of other democratic questions that it is necessary for a working class that wants to become a ruling class to understand and to have an attitude to, and to bring other people along with them. Okay? You mentioned a few issues yourself to do, women's movement and so on and so forth. There's a whole number of issues that a serious working class organisation that aspires to become the political ruling class must have a programme for. In a certain sense, it's easy to have a revolution. They are spontaneous. Things suddenly happen. They are in large measure out of control, and the actual seizure of power is the easy part. It's what you then do. It's what program you have to change to a different society. You have to have some idea about that. You have to have some sort of a program. And to do that is also, you have to come to that on the basis of struggle and the sorts of arguments we have here, okay? And looking at history, including a lot of the crack history to which you refer, and pointing to very obvious mistakes and errors. Okay. So, to my mind, I think that one of the things that was very obvious to me in the London Docks where I worked, that the London Docks probably, at a certain stage in its history, in the early 60s, was probably the most, it was the most militant period of working class struggle in the British trade union movement, as far as I can see. And there are a whole number of government inquiries into why that was and how they could stop it. Okay. In large measure, it was led by the old Communist Party, which, you know, I can be very critical of. If we look at the history of it, we could, even at that time, you can be very critical of. You can point to all sorts of errors. It was a Stalinized party and so on. But it was capable at that stage of leading very, very strong rank-and-file militant discussions and struggles. And there was a period in the early 60s where I think in the space of 2 years, in London Docks alone, there were 400 disputes. Every single one of them was unofficial. The two main unions had absolutely no control over it at all. They were all rank-and-file led, all by unofficial committees. Okay? And they had this whole series of inquiries. And basically, they ended up getting the right character in the end, Lord Devlin, who come up with a solution. And the solution was, on the one hand, for the ruling class, of how to deal with these militants and all of this trouble, but also it was a solution for the trade union bureaucrats. Okay. And what they did, in effect, was to incorporate all of these unofficial committees and all these rank-and-file trade union militants into the official structures of the union. So what were all the unofficial committees became shop stewards committees. We achieved a certain degree of worker control. No one could be sacked in the docks because you had 50% representation. Pretty well you could only be sacked if you were convicted of a criminal offence. That's the only way you could get it past the union. There were all sorts of levels of control. In where I worked in London Docks, we had control of the allocation of work, the Shop Stewards Committee. You know, the ships would come in, we decided who worked on what ship. Okay. We had complete control of the overtime rotas, and we could decide we're not working, or we are working, or if we are working, there's going to be 50 men, or there's only going to be 2 men. So we had complete control of that. All of these things won through rank-and-file struggles. Okay. And the solution that Lord Devlin came up with to deal with this problem, which was characterised by one of the employers had no problems. There was no disputes among the lighterage firms in this militant period, which he thought was very interesting. This required much greater investigation. But when he went to them, they basically said, look, we gave up. We gave up fighting because we're negotiating with the Communist Party. It's pointless. You know, what's the point of us having an argument about wages for lighterage men in London if the Communist Party can pull the country up? So they just concede all the time. So they were in a desperate situation. They had to do something. And it was to incorporate all these rank-and-file militants into official structures, to bring in full-time shop stewards. Now, there were sections of my shop stewards committee was one of them. For a long, long time, we fought against, it's interesting when you look at the situation now, we fought for years against facility time. Facility time to us was a management-inspired attempt to corrupt the shop stewards committee and to move us away from the rank and file. Have the shop stewards all go and sit in an office away from the workers. Our attitude was, we are with the workers, we do the same job as them, and we represent them directly. So there was a whole series of ruling class inspired initiatives which basically the employers were told to implement and the trade unions were told to implement to try and undermine the rank and file committees, which they did to some extent. But it took years. It took even 20 years later. I was still operating both officially and unofficially. You could go to a union meeting, say on a wages dispute, where the officials would explain that's the best deal we could get you, and this has been agreed at the National Joint Council, which is binding arbitration on the whole of the union for the whole country and every dock in the country. And we were there as the official shop stewards. We'd go back to our own place of work, call a mass meeting and overturn it. Okay, so even though that they attempted to implement these, there was a backlash against it for years and years. But what was very obvious, and this came out really starkly during the miners' strike, for example, the article you remember I wrote following your one, was that there were 2 docks disputes in support of the miners' strike during the miners' dispute. And it was, contrary to public knowledge, both of those disputes were organised by the National Unofficial Port Shop Stewards Committee. Okay. Everyone always automatically thought that was a Transport and General Workers official policy. It wasn't. It was organised by the unofficial committees. Okay. And the first one, we contrived it. We contrived a breach of the dock labour scheme in order to get dockers out with a sympathetic transport employer up in the north. Okay. But what became obvious through that first dispute, and especially the second dispute, was the ease with which both the government and the trade union bureaucracy completely scuppered us, the way they could completely take control of that dispute. It wasn't enough for us to be militant workers engaged in the struggle, in a solidarity struggle with miners. Okay. There was a whole number of features about it that made it very, very easy for them to scupper it, not least our own weakness. The fact that we had to, in the first instance, contrive the dispute because we were not strong enough to say, let's all go out in support of the miners. We weren't strong enough to do that. They'd been running down the docks. There was offers of money to go, up to £30,000 at that time for anybody who wanted to leave. The fact that they'd split away all the profitable ports that were unregistered, and a lot of the big traffic was going through there. So there was a lot of weaknesses that we had. So we had to contrive the dispute and hope through the struggle, building up the solidarity. Okay. But that gave a gift to the trade union bureaucrats and to the government, because all they had to do was solve the basis of that dispute, the contrived dispute, a breach of the scheme, and put their hands up and say, sorry, it won't happen again, and the trade union leaders call off the dispute. Okay. There were several attempts, actually, it took them to call off the dispute because we resisted, but they got there in the end. Okay. The second time, the government deliberately engineered it at a time that suited them in order to stop, because they knew that we were going to come at it again. So in order to cut us off, they organised it themselves. Okay. So what I'm saying is that at that time, in an industry which had a long, long history of industrial militancy, of unofficial action, of much greater rank and file control than in many, many other workplace organisations, they beat us fairly easily. And the big missing gap that existed then was we didn't have a party. There was no party of the class coordinating those struggles. That wasn't the case in a slightly earlier period in the 70s, for example, when Bert Ramelson, who was the then industrial organiser of the old Communist Party, who was named as the most dangerous man in Britain, contrived to sack Ted Heath. He contrived to sack a Tory government. In a dispute then, it was him, with a phone call, managed to call out the steelworks in support of other workers and effectively sacked a Tory government through that action. Now that was a degenerate, Stalinised Communist Party that you could drive a tractor through. You could point to all sorts of weaknesses and problems and errors that party made, but it had sufficient power and influence with militant rank and file workers across a range of industries to bring down a government. That was gone. Even that weak and situation that we would be highly critical of, that was completely missing during the miners' strike. In fact, by that time, you even had a section of the Communist Party leadership, a clique within the leadership, who were actually stabbing the miners in the back, right, deliberately sabotaging it. So you had a situation in the old Communist Party with a leadership clique stabbing them in the back and undermining the miners' struggle, but ordinary rank and file communists out collecting money and doing whatever support they could. Okay. But what didn't happen and what should have happened is we should have had a party helping the dockers to solidify their dispute, linking it up with the miners, and trying to bring out other transport workers, in particular the railways. That's what a party can do. Okay. So I think that, you know, I can understand, and in fact, in the situation I'm in now, if I'm now in Unison, I despair. I absolutely despair. Part of it is because I come from an industry where, you know, it's a bit like I was at the University of Class Struggle, and I've now been sent back to kindergarten. It's what it feels like. But I absolutely despair at the state of the trade unions, the incredible lack of democracy, the almost total lack of any rank and file control over the union, and the fact that the bulk of the left have merely become entrenched in that bureaucracy and are just as undemocratic. Unison was set up by a bunch of right-wing trade union leaders, and the constitution of it was set up to maintain right-wing control over rank and file militants. That's how it was organised. That was how the constitution was set up, and the left have just slotted straight into it. I despair at it. Okay. But so that's the situation we are in now, and I can understand, you know, from me looking at that, I have a certain amount of sympathy with Dave's position. I can understand it, but I think it's very interesting that international workers of the world arose in the United States.
Industry.
Yeah. What did I say?
International. A lot of people say that.
Yeah, the Wobblies. That they arose in the United States, and that they were particularly of some influence in countries like Britain, Canada, Australia. Right? And I think this goes back to a critique that originally came back years and years before from Marx and Engels about the political backwardness of particularly the United States and Britain. The fact that, unlike a lot of other European countries that had working class parties, they didn't. There was a political backwardness in those situations. And you can understand workers, militant workers, without the benefit of a party, doing the best they can, which is we need to unite, we need to fight, we need to be international. You can understand it, okay? But it's not enough, I think, and I think there's lots and lots of history and lots of experience that shows it's not enough. We have to have a political party that thinks beyond that this is a bad situation and that we want a new type of world. You have to have a program, right? Another side to this, of course, and I think this comes back to this, you know, your elitism thing, and our view, and I think the view of classic Marxists is that a communist party is not a communist party if it is not an integral part of the working class. If it isn't an integral part of the working class, it is not a communist party. It cannot be. Okay. To that extent, I mean, to some extent, this is why we call the Central Committee the Provisional Central Committee. It's a limitation. We are not a proper communist party. We cannot possibly be a communist party because we're not a part of the class. It's an ambition. It's a hope. It's what we want to build. Okay. But I've lost my train of thought now. Program and elitism. Yeah, this is it. There's lots of discussion quite often about this idea of an elite communist party, and you basically have intellectuals who come and tell the workers, this is how it is, this is the situation. So, well, yes, we do have to have intellectuals. There are, if you look at Marx and Engels, for example, they are not your typical working class militants, okay? But hell, did they give us a gift, right? So you do need people who also have the time and the ability to do research and to come up with ideas and programs and so on. But it's a two-way street, okay? What is also needed is a feedback. Those ideas and theories and so on have to be tested in practice, okay? And there has to be a feedback, and they need to learn from the workers, right? So long as they don't learn from the workers or are not in a position where they can learn from the workers, there is a terrible weakness. That's the weakness of the bulk of the left today. It's the weakness of the CPGB, right? We are very limited purely by the fact that we cannot engage in struggles as a communist party. We're not big enough. Okay. So I think I'll finish there.
Can I just pick up a couple of things? I mean, to my recollection in 1970,